So we're now going to be building the Google Auth class and setting up a few things beforehand, like including our composer autoload file into our initialization file. And we will be connecting to Google, using our API information. We'll define all of the methods that we need, and then we'll start to fill them in, and we'll talk about what they actually mean. And we'll be sort of wrapping this up in this part, and then later on we'll look at storing database details and stuff like that. So inside of init, we currently only are including in our database class, which we obviously need to do more here. But what we also need to do is, because we're making use of PHP sessions, we need to use the PHP session initializer, and that is just simply session_start. Like so. So we also want to require in classes / Google auth.php. So that's this file here that we're going to be building in this part. But as I mentioned earlier, we want to include the vendor autoload file. And this is because we have our Google API library available to use. So inside of init, up here before we do anything else, we want to require in classes vendor / autoload.php. So let's just check that works and that nothing is not getting included. We don't see any errors. Perfect. So inside of index.php, you know that we're including in our app init file, which is good. But what we need to do is we need to instantiate our DB and an instance of our Google client in order to pass these in as dependencies to our Google Auth class. So let's create a new DB. We've already seen an example of this in the previous video. So we create a new instance of our DB, and we want to create a new instance of our Google client. So that's a new Google_client. So this is what we're including inside of our dependency. So let's just refresh our page just to make sure that we don't see any errors. Everything looks like it is fine. Cool. So now we'll start to build our Google Auth class, so we can actually instantiate our Google Auth class here and start to use methods like checking if the token exists to get our authentication URL. And we saw that earlier when we clicked through using the login button. So inside of Google Auth, let's start to define this class out now. So I've just called this Google Auth, pretty straightforward. We also need a couple of private properties. This is simply just going to be the dependencies. This is going to be the DB and the client. And we'll look at how we pass these into our construct in a moment. So we have a private DB and we have a private client. Now we can have these as protected. We don't necessarily have to have them as private. It doesn't really matter. So we have our construct function. We already saw this in the last part. This is basically what runs when we instantiate this. And we're also going to type hint on the things that are passed into this. So basically what we want to do is we want inside of index to say auth equals new Google Auth. Remember, that's the object class that we just created, and we want to pass in the DB and the Google client so we can make use of the database and we can make use of the Google client functionality. So once we've done that, let's head over to here and type check. So we just basically say we want this to be a DB object, and that's a DB, and we want the next to be a Google client, and that's going to be a Google client. And the reason that we do this is because basically type hinting allows us to just have sort of more of an enforcement on what's passed in here. So for example, if I was to, let's just get rid of these, if I was to pass in an integer, say 1 here, and I refresh, you see we get an argument passed to Google Auth must be an instance of Google Client integer given. So it gives us quite a descriptive error basically. So now that we've done that and that's all working, like so, we can start to build everything we need to in here. Well, not everything we need to, but just connecting. But we're going to set the DB that we passed in, the Google client we passed in, to here. And we're also going to set the client to Google client. Cool. So now that we've done that, we can use this client, so we can reference this client, and we can do things like set the client ID. Now remember, these came from this page here, so we can simply just pass these in. So for the client ID, this is this here, so we can copy that and paste this in. Perfect. The next thing we want to do is set the client secret. So we say this client set client secret. So this will just be the here, like so. Now we also want to set the redirect URI. I already have mine set up on here, but you're going to need to go ahead and change that to the redirect URI that you're using. So this points to index.php in my case. It'll likely point to a different domain and a different folder in your case, so you will need to change this, or you'll get an error when you try and generate the auth login key. So we say set redirect URI, and we go ahead and we provide whatever we provide in here. This must be valid as well. And obviously this needs to be changed when you go into production and you're using this on a production environment. The last thing that we want to do is set the scopes for this, and this will be sent along with a request to Google when we ask to authenticate via an account. And this is really important because it defines sort of how much you're asking from your user. And you can go ahead and research, and you might want to pull in more information or less information here. But in my case, I want to say this client set scopes, and all I'm going to provide, super easy, is email. This is all the information I need back from the user because that's all we're storing inside of our database here. So now that that's done, this should all work. Let's just check that we haven't made any syntax mistakes. Perfect. Everything looks like it's working okay. If there are any problems later on down the line, we can deal with this. So now we've set up our initial Google Auth, we're going to just take a quick break and go over and create the markup for this page, and then we'll come back and we'll start to actually build the rest of this functionality.